Bible stories. Moses, David, Daniel, Jesus, Noah. Welcome to my channel.
There are letters in history that comfort, letters that gently guide people back when they begin to lose their way. And then there are letters that feel like fire. Letters that do not whisper but confront, that do not ease into correction but strike at the very center of what has gone wrong. And the letter to the Galatians is one of those letters, because something had happened that could not be ignored. Something dangerous, not because it was obvious, but because it was subtle, because it did not look like rebellion. It looked like devotion. It did not appear as rejection of truth. It appeared as an attempt to strengthen it, and that is what made it so dangerous. Because the churches in Galatia were not collapsing under persecution. They were not being destroyed from the outside. They were changing from within, slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifting away from the very message that had given them life in the first place. And when Paul the Apostle heard what was happening, his reaction was immediate, not calm, not measured, but urgent, almost shocked, as if he could not believe how quickly everything had begun to unravel. And that is why he begins his letter not with comfort but with astonishment, because what they were doing was not a small mistake. It was a turning, a movement away from something that had been clearly given to them, something that had not come from human invention but from divine revelation, and yet they were abandoning it, not in open rebellion, but in quiet substitution, replacing it with something that looked familiar but carried a completely different weight. Because the message that had begun to circulate among them did not deny Jesus. It did not openly reject faith. It added to it. It introduced the idea that what Christ had done was not enough on its own, that something more was required, something measurable, something visible, something that could be controlled, and that something was the law. Specifically the traditions and requirements that had defined identity for generations. Circumcision, rituals, observance, markers that separated people into those who were truly accepted and those who were not. And at first glance it may have seemed reasonable, because the law had history, it had authority, it had structure, it gave people a sense of clarity, a way to measure themselves, a way to know where they stood, and that is always the appeal of it, because faith requires trust in something unseen, but rules offer the illusion of certainty. They give the feeling of control, and slowly, without realizing the full consequence, the Galatians began to shift their trust away from what had been done for them and toward what they could do for themselves. And that shift, though small in appearance, changed everything, because the moment you add to the gospel, you do not improve it, you alter it. And when you alter it, you lose what made it powerful in the first place. And Paul understood this with absolute clarity, which is why his words carry such intensity, because he is not addressing a minor misunderstanding. He is confronting a distortion that strikes at the core of faith itself, and he begins by establishing something that cannot be questioned, that his authority does not come from human approval, that he is not an apostle because someone appointed him or because he earned the position, but because he was called directly, that his message is not his own, it is not shaped by opinion or tradition, it comes from Christ, and that makes what is happening even more serious, because to reject the message is not simply to disagree with Paul. It is to turn away from the one who called them, and that is why he describes their actions not as confusion but as desertion, because they are not just exploring ideas, they are leaving something behind, abandoning the very source of their calling, and what they are turning to is described as another gospel. But even that phrase is corrected immediately, because there is no other, there is no alternative version, no second path, no adjustment that can be made without losing the truth entirely. And anything that claims to be a variation of the gospel is not a variation at all. It is something entirely different disguised as truth. And this is where Paul draws a line that cannot be softened, declaring that even if he himself, or anyone else, even an angel, were to present a message that contradicts what has already been given, it is to be rejected completely, because truth does not change based on the messenger. It does not adapt to preference. It remains what it is regardless of who speaks, and this is what makes the situation so critical, because the deception they are facing is not obvious. It does not appear as darkness, it appears as light. It presents itself as deeper commitment, as stronger obedience, as a more complete version of faith. And yet beneath it lies a shift that changes everything. because it moves the focus from what Christ has done to what individuals must do. It replaces dependence on grace with reliance on effort, and in doing so it removes the very thing that makes the gospel what it is, because if salvation depends even in part on human action, then it is no longer a gift, it becomes something earned, something achieved, something that can be measured, and the moment that happens, freedom disappears, replaced by obligation, by pressure, by the constant need to prove oneself, and that is what Paul is fighting against, not rules themselves, but the idea that rules can replace grace, that human effort can stand alongside what Christ has already completed, because once that idea takes hold, everything begins to shift, slowly at first, almost unnoticed, but steadily moving further and further away from the truth, and that is the real danger, not sudden rejection, but gradual drift, the kind that feels safe because it happens in small steps, the kind that feels justified because it is supported by logic and tradition, until one day the distance becomes clear, and what once felt close is no longer recognizable. And Paul sees that distance forming. He sees where it leads, and he refuses to remain silent, because what is at stake is not a preference or a practice, it is the foundation itself, and if the foundation is lost, everything built upon it will eventually fall. And so he writes not to comfort, but to confront, not to gently guide, but to pull them back before the drift becomes complete, because what they are losing is not small, it is everything. If the message Paul defended was not from man, then the question that naturally followed was this: where did it come from, and why should anyone trust him over the voices that now seemed so confident, so persuasive, so certain in their claims? Because the people in Galatia were not foolish, they were being influenced, shaped by arguments that sounded structured, arguments that appealed to tradition, arguments that made faith feel more secure by attaching it to visible requirements, and in that environment, authority mattered, credibility mattered. And that is exactly where Paul turns next, not to defend himself in the way most people would, not by listing achievements or building a reputation based on human approval, but by telling a story that should have disqualified him from everything he now claimed to be, because before he was known as Paul the Apostle, he was known as Saul, a man whose life stood in direct opposition to the message he now preached, a man who did not misunderstand the gospel but actively fought against it, who did not ignore the early followers of Christ but pursued them with intensity, believing with absolute conviction that what they represented was dangerous, that it threatened the very foundation of what he had been taught, and so he acted accordingly, not passively, not reluctantly, but with zeal, with a passion that drove him to take action, to move beyond disagreement into persecution, entering homes, dragging people out, approving punishments that would silence what he believed needed to be stopped. And this is not the kind of past one highlights to gain trust. It is the kind that raises questions, that creates doubt, that forces people to ask how someone can move from one extreme to another without losing credibility entirely. And yet that is exactly why Paul tells it, because his authority does not rest on consistency of human effort, it rests on transformation, and transformation of that magnitude demands explanation, because people do not simply change direction like that. They do not move from opposition to devotion without something happening that redefines everything. And Paul makes it clear that what changed him was not persuasion, not argument, not gradual learning, but revelation. Something that did not come from human teaching but from an encounter that interrupted everything he thought he understood. Something that did not adjust his beliefs but overturned them completely. And in that moment the foundation of his life shifted. Not because he chose to rethink his position, but because he was confronted with a reality he could not deny. And that reality was Christ, not as an idea, not as a debated figure, but as truth revealed in a way that left no room for uncertainty. And from that point forward, his message was not something he received secondhand, not something passed down through others, not something shaped by the apostles in Jerusalem or approved by any human authority. It was something given directly, something that came from the very source the Galatians were now in danger of abandoning. And that is the core of his argument, because if his message came from Christ, then it does not need validation from man. And if it does not need validation from man, then it cannot be altered by those who claim authority through tradition or structure. And to make that even clearer, Paul emphasizes what he did not do after this transformation. He did not immediately go to those who were already established. He did not seek approval. He did not ask for permission to speak. He did not place himself under their authority as though his calling depended on their recognition. Instead, he stepped away into regions where his understanding could deepen without interference, where the message given to him could take root without being reshaped by expectation or pressure. And only after time had passed did he go to Jerusalem, not as a student seeking instruction, but as someone already carrying a message, someone whose authority did not originate in that place but could stand independently of it. And even then, his interaction was limited, brief, enough to establish connection but not enough to suggest dependence, because the point he is making is not isolation, it is independence of origin, that what he teaches is not derived from human systems but from divine revelation. And this is crucial, because the false teachers in Galatia were building their case on association, on tradition, on alignment with established practices, and Paul dismantles that by showing that truth does not require that kind of support. It does not need to be reinforced by human structures to be valid. It stands on its own because of where it comes from, and this is where the tension deepens. Because if Paul is right, then the message being introduced in Galatia is not just an addition, it is a contradiction. And if it is a contradiction, then it cannot coexist with what they originally received, which means the people are not expanding their faith, they are replacing it, and that realization forces a decision, because two opposing foundations cannot support the same structure. One will always undermine the other, and Paul knows this, which is why he does not soften his tone. Because the situation does not allow for neutrality, it demands clarity. It demands a recognition that what is at stake is not preference but truth, not method but meaning, not tradition but transformation. And so he continues to build his case, not through abstract argument but through the undeniable reality of his own life. Because if a man who once destroyed the church now builds it, if a man who once opposed the message now risks everything to defend it, then something beyond human influence must be at work. And that is exactly what he wants the Galatians to see, not him, but the source behind him, not his authority as a person, but the authority of the message he carries. Because the moment they begin to trust the source, they will recognize the distortion for what it is, not an improvement, not a deeper level of commitment, but a departure from the very thing that gave them life. And once that becomes clear, the question is no longer which message sounds better, but which one is true. And that is the question Paul is forcing them to face, not gently, not gradually, but directly. Because the longer they delay, the further they drift, and the further they drift, the harder it becomes to return. And so he writes with urgency, with intensity, with a clarity that leaves no room for confusion. Because this is not about winning an argument, it is about restoring a foundation before it is lost completely. The tension that had been building beneath the surface could not remain hidden forever, because truth, when placed beside distortion, does not quietly coexist. It forces a confrontation. And for Paul the Apostle, that confrontation became unavoidable when the question of the gospel moved beyond individual teaching and into the heart of the early church itself, where leaders, traditions, expectations, and authority all intersected, creating a moment that would determine not just what was believed, but how it would be preserved, because the issue was no longer theoretical. It had become visible, embodied in people, in decisions, in the way communities were forming and defining who truly belonged. And at the center of it all stood a dividing line that seemed small on the surface but carried enormous weight, whether faith in Christ alone was enough, or whether it needed to be completed through adherence to the law. And that question could not remain unanswered, because the answer would shape everything that followed. And so Paul went to Jerusalem, not as someone seeking approval, but as someone carrying a message that needed to be clarified in the presence of those recognized as pillars. Because if the gospel was to remain intact, it had to be recognized not as one version among many, but as the truth itself. And when he arrived, he did not present his message publicly at first. He spoke privately with those who were influential, laying before them the gospel he preached among the Gentiles, not out of insecurity, but out of purpose, ensuring that there would be no division at the foundation, no contradiction that could later fracture what had begun. And in that setting, something significant happened. Something that revealed the nature of the conflict more clearly than any argument could, because alongside Paul stood a man named Titus, a Greek, a Gentile, someone who represented exactly what was being debated, whether a person could belong fully without adopting the identity markers of the law. And Titus was not circumcised, and that fact alone became a test, not of ritual, but of truth. Because if the gospel required the law to be complete, then Titus would need to conform. He would need to change. He would need to become something more than what he already was in Christ. But if the gospel was truly sufficient, then nothing needed to be added, nothing needed to be enforced, and the decision made in that moment spoke louder than any declaration. Titus was not compelled, not forced, not pressured. And that absence of requirement confirmed something essential. That the message Paul carried was not lacking. It was not incomplete. It did not need to be supplemented by human tradition to be valid. And yet even in that clarity, the opposition did not disappear, because false brothers had infiltrated, not openly, not in a way that could be easily dismissed, but quietly, observing, questioning, seeking to impose requirements that would reshape the freedom the gospel had created. And their goal was not simply to add structure. It was to bring believers back under a system of control, to turn freedom into obligation, to replace grace with regulation. And Paul recognized the danger immediately, not as a minor disagreement, but as a direct threat to the very essence of what had been revealed. And so he did something that defined his entire approach. He did not yield, not even for a moment, because yielding, even slightly, would have signaled that the addition was acceptable, that the distortion could stand alongside the truth. And that was something he refused to allow, because he understood that once the foundation is compromised, everything built upon it begins to shift. And this is where the weight of the moment becomes clear, because the leaders in Jerusalem, those who had walked with Christ, those whose voices carried authority, did not oppose him, they did not correct him, they did not add to his message. Instead, they recognized what had been given to him. They saw that the same God who worked through them had worked through him, that the mission entrusted to Paul among the Gentiles was not separate from theirs, but aligned with it. And this recognition did not come with conditions. It came with affirmation. They extended to him the right hand of fellowship, not as a gesture of approval from above, but as a recognition of shared truth, of unity in the gospel. And this moment should have settled everything. It should have silenced the argument. It should have made it clear that the message of grace stood complete. But human behavior does not always follow clarity, and even those who understand truth can struggle to live consistently within it. And that is where the tension rises again, not in theory, but in action. Not in what is taught, but in what is practiced, because later, in a place called Antioch, something happened that revealed how deeply this issue affected even the most respected leaders. Because Peter the apostle, who had once stood firm, who had eaten with Gentiles, who had lived out the freedom the gospel provided, began to withdraw, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, stepping back from those he had once embraced, separating himself in a way that sent a message without words, and that message was clear, that something was still required, that full acceptance was not as complete as it had seemed. And the reason for his withdrawal was not conviction, it was fear, fear of those who still held tightly to the law, fear of judgment, fear of how his actions would be perceived, and that fear led to compromise, and that compromise did not remain isolated. It spread, influencing others, even drawing Barnabas into the same pattern, and suddenly, what had been established as truth was being contradicted by behavior, and that contradiction could not be ignored, because when actions deny what words affirm, confusion follows, and confusion is the ground where distortion grows. And so Paul confronted Peter, not privately, not quietly, but openly, because the issue was public, the impact was visible, and the truth needed to be just as clear as the error, and his words cut directly to the heart of the matter. If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you now force Gentiles to live like Jews? It was not an attack on Peter's character, it was a challenge to inconsistency, a call to align behavior with truth. Because the gospel does not change based on who is watching. It does not adjust to pressure. It remains what it is regardless of context. And this moment reveals something critical, that the battle for the gospel is not only against false teaching, but against subtle compromise, against the tendency to adjust truth to fit expectation. And Paul refuses to allow that, because he knows what is at stake, that if the line is blurred, even slightly, the clarity of the message is lost, and once that clarity is gone, everything becomes uncertain. And so he brings the argument to its core, not through tradition, not through authority, but through truth itself, that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Christ. And that statement does not exist as an idea. It stands as a dividing line, separating two completely different ways of understanding relationship with God, one based on effort, the other based on grace, one requiring constant performance, the other rooted in completed work. And the Galatians now stood between those two paths, influenced by voices that pulled them toward the familiar, toward what could be controlled, toward what felt measurable, and Paul writes to pull them back, to remind them of what had already been established, to show them that the gospel they received was not incomplete, not lacking, not in need of addition, but fully sufficient, and that anything added to it does not strengthen it, it replaces it. And that is the tension that now defines everything, because the question is no longer theoretical, it is personal, it is immediate, it demands a response. Will they remain in freedom, or will they return to something that looks right but leads them away from the truth they were given? The confrontation had exposed something deeper than disagreement, something that could not be ignored or explained away with careful words or softened interpretations. Because what had happened was not just a moment of inconsistency, it was a revelation of how easily truth can be compromised when pressure is applied, when fear begins to shape decisions, when the desire to be accepted starts to outweigh the commitment to what is right. And for Paul the Apostle, this was not a moment to retreat or to negotiate. It was a moment to define the gospel with absolute clarity. Because if there was any ambiguity left, any space where misunderstanding could grow, it would eventually lead the Galatians back into the very system they had been set free from. And so he moves from narrative to declaration, from recounting events to establishing truth in a way that cannot be reinterpreted. Because what is at stake is not behavior alone, it is identity. It is the question of how a person stands before God, not in theory, but in reality. And Paul makes it clear that justification, the act of being made right, does not come through works of the law. It cannot be achieved through effort. It cannot be earned through obedience to rules, no matter how sacred those rules may seem, because if it could, then Christ's death would be unnecessary. It would become an addition rather than the foundation. And that is something Paul refuses to accept, because to suggest that human effort contributes to justification is to diminish what has already been done. It is to imply that the work of Christ is incomplete, that it requires supplementation, that it needs to be reinforced by human action, and that idea does not strengthen faith, it destroys it. Because it shifts the focus away from grace and places it back on the individual, creating a system where acceptance must be maintained, where standing must be proven, where assurance is replaced by uncertainty. And this is where Paul's words take on a deeply personal tone, because he is not speaking in abstract theology. He is speaking from experience, from transformation, from a life that has already passed through the very system he now rejects as a means of justification. And he brings it into a single, powerful statement that captures everything he is trying to communicate, that he has been crucified with Christ, that his old identity, the one defined by law, by achievement, by status, is no longer what defines him. It has been put to death, and the life he now lives is not sustained by his own effort, but by faith in the one who loved him and gave himself for him. And that statement does not exist as poetry. It is a reality that reshapes everything, because if the old self is gone, then the system that defined it no longer has authority. It no longer determines worth. It no longer dictates standing. And that is what the Galatians are in danger of forgetting, that they are not trying to become something through the law. They have already been made something through Christ, and to return to the law as a means of justification is not progress, it is regression. It is stepping back into a system that cannot produce what it demands, a system that reveals failure without providing the power to overcome it. And this is where the logic of Paul's argument becomes unavoidable, because if righteousness could be gained through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. And that statement forces a decision because it removes the possibility of combining the two. It makes it clear that you cannot hold on to grace while depending on the law. You cannot stand in what has been given while trying to earn what has already been completed. One must give way to the other. And the Galatians, whether they realized it or not, were standing at that exact point, trying to hold both, trying to maintain faith while adding requirements, trying to secure their position through effort, and in doing so, they were moving away from the very thing that had secured them in the first place. And Paul sees this not as confusion, but as a dangerous shift that must be corrected, because the longer it continues, the more deeply it takes root, the more it reshapes how they think, how they act, how they understand their relationship with God. And so he presses further, not only explaining what justification is not, but showing what it truly means, that it is not something achieved, but something received, not something built, but something given, and that gift does not come with conditions that must be maintained through human strength. It comes with a new identity that changes the way everything is lived out. And this is where the tension reaches a new level, because the message Paul presents removes control. It removes the ability to measure oneself through visible actions. It removes the sense of earning and replaces it with dependence, with trust, with a reliance on something that cannot be manipulated or managed. And that is uncomfortable, because control feels safer, effort feels more tangible, rules feel more predictable, but none of those things can produce what only grace can provide. And that is the truth Paul is fighting to preserve, not just for the Galatians, but for the integrity of the gospel itself, because once grace is replaced, even partially, the entire structure changes, and what remains may look similar on the surface. It may carry the same language, the same symbols, the same outward expressions, but at its core it becomes something entirely different, something that binds rather than frees, something that demands rather than gives, something that ultimately leads not to assurance but to constant striving. And Paul refuses to let that become the foundation of their faith, because he knows where it leads. He has lived it. He has seen its limits. He has experienced its inability to produce the righteousness it demands. And now, having been set free from it, he will not allow others to return to it under the illusion that it brings them closer to God, because the truth is the opposite. It creates distance, not through rebellion, but through reliance on the wrong foundation. And that is why his words carry such urgency, such intensity, because this is not a matter that can be left unresolved. It demands clarity. It demands a decision. It demands that the Galatians recognize what is happening and choose whether they will remain in what they have received, or return to something that cannot give them what they are seeking. And as the argument continues to unfold, the line becomes sharper, the contrast more defined, the choice more unavoidable, because the gospel does not exist in partial form. It is either fully embraced or fundamentally altered, and the direction they choose will determine not only what they believe, but how they live, how they see themselves, and how they understand the very nature of their relationship with God. The argument had been laid out with clarity, the foundation had been defined, and yet Paul knew that understanding alone was not enough, because people do not drift away from truth simply because they lack information. They drift because something else begins to feel more convincing, more tangible, more secure. And that is why he turns from explanation to confrontation, not in anger, but in urgency. Because the Galatians were not just thinking differently, they were moving in a direction that would reshape everything about their faith. And he addresses them directly, not as a distant teacher, but as someone deeply invested in what they were becoming, calling them foolish, not as an insult, but as a wake-up call. A way of breaking through the illusion that what they were doing made sense, because from Paul's perspective, the shift they were making was not logical. It was irrational. It contradicted everything they had already experienced, everything they had already received, and he brings them back to the beginning, not to theory, but to memory, asking them a question that cuts through argument and goes straight to reality. How did you receive the Spirit? Was it by works of the law, or by hearing with faith? And the answer is obvious, undeniable, because their experience did not begin with effort, it began with belief. It began with trust in what they heard, not with adherence to rules, not with conformity to a system, but with a response to the message of Christ, and that is where everything started. And if that is where it started, then why would they now turn to something else to continue? Why would they begin with the Spirit and attempt to be completed by the flesh? Why would they move from dependence on God to reliance on themselves? And that question exposes the contradiction at the heart of their actions, because what they were doing was not building on what they had received. They were replacing the foundation with something entirely different, something that could not produce the same result. And Paul presses further, reminding them of what they had experienced, not just intellectually, but personally, the transformation, the power, the evidence of God's work among them. And he asks whether those things came through the law or through faith. And again, the answer is clear, because the law does not produce life, it reveals failure. It defines boundaries but does not empower obedience. It shows what is required but does not provide the ability to fulfill it. And that is why the shift they were making was so dangerous. Because they were turning to something that could not give them what they were seeking. Something that would only increase the burden, not remove it. And to make his point even clearer, Paul reaches back into the history they respected so deeply, to a figure they would recognize, a figure that stood at the very root of their understanding, Abraham, because if anyone represented the foundation of faith, it was him. And Paul reminds them that Abraham was not justified by works. He was justified by faith, that his relationship with God was established not through adherence to a system, but through belief, through trust in what was promised, and that truth existed before the law was ever given, before the structure they were now trying to adopt, before the identity markers they were being told were necessary, which means that faith is not a new concept. It is the original one. It is the foundation upon which everything else was meant to build. And those who share that faith are the true descendants of Abraham, not defined by physical markers, but by the same trust that defined him. And this shifts the entire perspective because it removes the idea that belonging is based on external conformity and replaces it with something internal, something rooted in belief rather than behavior. And Paul continues, showing that the promise given to Abraham was always meant to extend beyond a single group, that it pointed forward to something greater, something that would include all nations, something that would be fulfilled not through the law, but through Christ. And this is where the contrast becomes even sharper, because the law operates on a different principle entirely. It is not based on faith, it is based on doing, on meeting requirements, on maintaining a standard that cannot be broken. And the problem is that no one meets that standard perfectly, which means that the law, instead of bringing life, brings a curse, because it defines failure without offering a way out. It sets the expectation without providing the solution. And that is the reality Paul wants them to see, that returning to the law is not returning to safety. It is returning to something that exposes their inability to achieve what it demands. And in that context, the work of Christ becomes even more significant, because he did not come to reinforce the law as a means of justification. He came to redeem from its curse, to take upon himself the consequence of failure, to provide a way that does not depend on human perfection. And through that, the blessing promised to Abraham becomes accessible not through law, but through faith. And this is where everything connects, where the past, the present, and the future align, showing that the gospel is not a break from what came before, but the fulfillment of it, and that fulfillment cannot be improved upon by adding requirements. It cannot be strengthened by returning to something that was never meant to be the foundation of justification in the first place. And Paul drives this point deeper, explaining that the law, which came later, does not nullify the promise. It does not replace it. It does not redefine it. Because if the inheritance depends on the law, then it no longer depends on the promise. And if it no longer depends on the promise, then faith is no longer central. And that is a shift that cannot be allowed, because it changes the nature of everything. And so the Galatians are faced with a reality that is becoming increasingly clear, that what they are being drawn toward is not an extension of their faith, it is a contradiction of it, that the system they are being encouraged to adopt cannot produce what they have already received, and that continuing down that path will not lead them forward. It will take them back, not into freedom, but into a structure that binds, that demands, that ultimately leaves them striving for something they can never fully attain. And Paul does not present this as a distant possibility. He presents it as an immediate danger, something that is already happening. something that must be recognized and corrected before it takes deeper root, because once the foundation shifts, everything else follows, and restoring it becomes more difficult. And so he continues to press, to remind, to confront, not because he wants to win an argument, but because he wants to protect what they have been given, to ensure that the freedom they began with is not replaced by something that appears strong but ultimately leads them away from the truth that set them free. If the law could not give life, then the question that remained, almost unavoidable at this point, was why it existed at all. Because for those listening, for the Galatians who are now caught between two competing messages, the law still carried weight, it still held authority, it still felt like something that must have purpose, something that could not simply be dismissed, and Paul knew that if he did not address this directly, the pull of it would remain, because people do not easily let go of systems that feel structured, systems that feel established, systems that provide a sense of control. And so he moves deeper, not stepping back from the tension, but stepping into it, explaining that the law was never meant to be the foundation of justification. It was never given as the means by which a person would be made right before God. Instead, it was added because of transgressions. It revealed sin. It exposed what was already present but not fully understood. It defined boundaries. It showed what righteousness looks like in contrast to failure, but it did not provide the power to achieve it. It functioned as a mirror, not a solution, and that distinction changes everything, because if the law reveals but does not restore, then it cannot be the path to life. It can only point to the need for something greater, something beyond itself. And that is exactly where Paul leads the argument, showing that the law was temporary, that it was given until the coming of the one to whom the promise was made, that it served a purpose within a specific time, but it was never intended to be permanent, never intended to replace what had already been established through promise. And this introduces a shift in understanding that challenges the very foundation of what the Galatians were being told. Because if the law is temporary, then returning to it is not progress, it is regression. It is stepping back into something that has already fulfilled its role, something that was never meant to be the final answer. And to make that even clearer, Paul uses an image that would have been immediately understood. The image of a guardian, a tutor, someone responsible for overseeing a child until the time appointed by the father, guiding, correcting, restricting, not as a permanent authority, but as a temporary one. And in that role, the law functioned in the same way. It held people under its structure, it kept them within boundaries, it pointed out their need, but it was never meant to define their identity forever. It was preparing them for something greater, something that would change their relationship entirely, and that change comes through faith. Because once faith has come, the role of the guardian is no longer needed. The relationship shifts from supervision to sonship, from restriction to belonging, from distance to intimacy, and this is where the argument reaches a new depth. Because Paul is no longer just explaining what the law does, he is redefining who the Galatians are, not as those under obligations, but as children of God through faith in Christ, and that identity is not earned, it is given. It is not maintained through performance. It is secured through what has already been done, and this changes everything about how they are to see themselves. Because if they are children, then they are no longer defined by the system that once governed them. They are no longer measured by the standards that once exposed their failure. They are part of something new, something that transcends the divisions that once separated people. And Paul makes that explicit, declaring that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, not because those distinctions cease to exist in reality, but because they no longer define access to God, they no longer determine value, they no longer create hierarchy within the relationship established through faith. And this is a radical shift, one that removes every external marker that people use to establish identity, replacing it with something internal, something rooted in Christ alone. And this is exactly what the false teachers were undermining, because by reintroducing the law as necessary, they were rebuilding the very divisions that the gospel had removed. They were reestablishing categories of acceptance, creating a system where some could be seen as more complete, more aligned, more acceptable based on their adherence to certain practices. And Paul refuses to allow that, because it contradicts the very nature of what has been established, and he continues to press the point, showing that those who belong to Christ are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise, not through law, not through ritual, but through faith. And that inheritance is not partial, it is not conditional in the way the law operates. It is complete, it is secure, it is rooted in what God has already declared, and this leads to one of the most powerful shifts in the entire letter, because Paul moves from the idea of inheritance to the experience of it, explaining that before faith came, people were enslaved to the basic principles of the world, bound by systems that governed behavior without transforming the heart. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that they might receive adoption as sons. And that word adoption carries weight, because it speaks of a change in status, a transition from outsider to family, from distance to belonging, from obligation to relationship. And it is not something achieved, it is something granted, something that cannot be earned because it is based on the decision of the one who gives it. And through that adoption, something else happens, something that confirms the reality of the relationship. The Spirit is given, not as a symbol, but as a presence, crying out from within, affirming that they are no longer slaves, but sons, no longer under authority that controls, but under a relationship that transforms. And this is where the contrast becomes undeniable, because slavery and sonship cannot coexist. They represent two completely different ways of relating, one based on obligation, the other on identity. One driven by fear, the other by belonging. And the Galatians, without fully realizing it, were moving back toward slavery, returning to a system that could not give them what they had already received. And Paul brings this into a deeply personal appeal, reminding them of their own past, of how they once did not know God, how they were enslaved to things that by nature were not God's. And now, having come to know God, or rather to be known by Him, how could they turn back again to weak and worthless principles? How could they return to something that holds no power, no life, no ability to transform? And this is where the emotional weight of his words becomes clear, because this is not just about doctrine, it is about relationship, about the reality of what they have experienced, about the danger of exchanging something living for something empty. And Paul sees it happening, not as a distant possibility, but as an active movement, as something already taking shape. And his concern is not abstract, it is immediate, it is personal. It is rooted in the fear that the work that has begun among them is being redirected towards something that cannot sustain it, something that will ultimately leave them where they started, or worse, further away from the truth they once embraced. And so he continues to call them back, not to a system, but to a relationship, not to rules, but to the reality of what it means to belong, because once that is understood, once that is embraced, the pull of the law loses its power, and the freedom of the gospel becomes not just an idea, but a lived reality. The argument had reached the point where logic alone was no longer enough, where explanation, even when clear, could still be resisted. Because people do not always turn away from truth due to lack of understanding. They turn because something else begins to feel more secure, more familiar, more controllable. And Paul knew this, which is why his tone begins to shift again, not away from truth, but deeper into it, moving from explanation into something more personal, more urgent, more revealing of what is truly at stake, because the Galatians were not simply choosing between two teachings. They were choosing between two identities, between two entirely different ways of relating to God, and that choice could not remain abstract. It had to be seen, it had to be felt. It had to be felt, it had to be understood in a way that reached beyond argument and into the core of who they believed themselves to be. And so Paul turns to an image, a story rooted in their own history, something familiar, something they would recognize immediately, yet presented in a way that reveals a deeper truth, a contrast that cannot be ignored. The story of Abraham and his two sons, one born from a slave woman, the other from a free woman. And at first, it may seem like a simple retelling, a reference to something already known, but Paul is not recounting history for its own sake. He is revealing what that history represents, because within it lies a picture of the very choice now before them, a distinction between two covenants, two ways of understanding relationship with God, one rooted in human effort, the other in divine promise, one producing slavery, the other freedom. And as he unfolds this image, the weight of it becomes clear, because the son born of the slave woman represents what is according to the flesh, something achieved through human action, through planning, through effort to bring about what God had promised, but in a way that relied on human ability rather than divine timing. And that effort, though it may have seemed justified, did not produce what was truly intended. It resulted in something that carried the mark of striving, of attempting to secure through action what could only be received through trust. And in contrast, the son born of the free woman represents what is according to promise, something not achieved but given, not produced through human strength but brought forth through God's faithfulness. And this is where the meaning deepens, because Paul is not simply contrasting two individuals, he is contrasting two systems, two paths, two identities, and he makes it explicit, connecting the slave woman to Mount Sinai, to the covenant of the law, to a system that binds, that places people under obligation, that defines them by what they must do, and connecting the free woman to something greater, to a promise that stands independent of human effort, to a relationship not defined by performance but by belonging. And this is not just a symbolic contrast. It is a direct challenge to what the Galatians were being drawn toward, because by returning to the law as a means of justification, they were aligning themselves with the system of slavery, choosing to place themselves under something that cannot give them what they already possess. And that realization is not comfortable, because it forces them to see their actions not as progress, but as regression, not as deeper commitment, but as a step back into something that restricts rather than frees. And Paul presses this further, bringing the contrast into the present, showing that this is not just about the past, it is about now, about what they are choosing in this moment. Because just as there was conflict between the two sons, so there is now tension between those who rely on the flesh and those who live by the promise, and that tension is not neutral. It creates pressure, it influences behavior, it pushes people to conform, to align with what feels dominant, what feels accepted, what feels secure, and that is exactly what the Galatians were experiencing. The pressure to adopt practices that would make them more acceptable in the eyes of those who valued the law. The pressure to adjust their identity to fit expectations, and Paul refuses to let that pressure define them because their identity does not come from external validation. It comes from what has already been established through Christ, and that identity is not one of slavery, but of freedom. And this is where his words become both a declaration and a call, because he is not only explaining who they are, he is urging them to live in alignment with that reality, to reject the pull of what contradicts it, to stand firm in what they have received, and to recognize that returning to the law is not a harmless adjustment. It is a fundamental shift that changes everything, and he makes this unmistakably clear, that those who are born according to the flesh will not inherit with those born according to promise, that the two cannot coexist in the way they might hope, because they operate on entirely different principles. And this forces a decision not just in belief, but in identity. Because to embrace one is to reject the other, to live in freedom is to step away from what binds, to trust in promise is to release dependence on effort. And this is where the emotional weight of the letter becomes undeniable, because Paul is not speaking to strangers, he is speaking to people he knows, people he has invested in, people whose transformation he has witnessed, and he reminds them of that, of how they once received him, not with suspicion, not with hesitation, but with openness, with honor, with a willingness to listen, even when his presence was not impressive by outward standards, even when there was nothing about him that would naturally draw admiration, and yet they welcomed him, they embraced the message he brought, they experienced the impact of it, and now something has changed, not in the message, but in them, and Paul feels that change, not as a distant observation, but as a personal loss, asking where that sense of blessing has gone. What has shifted? What has drawn them away from the very thing that once brought them life? And he sees the answer in those who are influencing them, those who are eager to win them over, not for their good, but to draw them into a system that creates dependence, that isolates them from the truth, that binds them to a structure that requires constant adherence. And this is where Paul's concern reaches its peak, because he is not only addressing error, he is fighting for relationship, for the connection that has been formed, for the truth that has been planted, And he expresses it in a way that reveals the depth of his investment, comparing his concern to the pain of childbirth, to the process of something being formed, shaped, brought into existence. And his desire is not simply that they return to correct thinking, but that Christ be formed in them, that their identity be fully aligned with what has been given, not partially, not influenced by competing systems, but completely rooted in the reality of who they are. And that desire carries urgency, because the longer they remain in this tension, the more difficult it becomes to return, the more deeply the alternative takes hold. And Paul knows this, which is why his words do not soften. They intensify, not in anger, but in clarity, because the situation demands it. Because what is at stake is not small, it is not secondary, it is the difference between freedom and slavery, between promise and performance, between living in what has been given and striving for what can never be fully achieved. And the Galatians now stand at that dividing line, not in theory, but in reality. And the direction they choose will determine not only how they live, but who they become. The line had been drawn with unmistakable clarity, the contrast between slavery and freedom laid bare in a way that could no longer be ignored. And now the question was no longer what is true, but what will you do with it? Because truth, once seen, demands response. It forces a decision. It refuses to remain theoretical. And Paul brings everything to this moment with a command that carries both urgency and weight. Stand firm in the freedom for which Christ has set you free, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. And that word, stand, is not passive. It implies resistance. It implies pressure. It implies that something is actively trying to pull them back. Something that will not simply disappear but must be opposed. And that is exactly what the Galatians were facing. A force that appeared convincing, structured, even righteous on the surface, but one that would ultimately bind them if they allowed it to take hold. And Paul does not leave room for compromise. He does not present this as a matter of balance or moderation. He speaks in absolute terms. If you accept circumcision as a requirement, then Christ will be of no advantage to you, not because circumcision itself carries power, but because what it represents changes the entire foundation. It shifts the basis of relationship from grace to obligation, from gift to requirement, and once that shift is made, everything else follows. Because to accept one part of the law as necessary is to place oneself under the obligation to keep all of it, and that is a burden no one can carry perfectly, a system that demands consistency without providing the ability to achieve it. And Paul makes this clear not as a theoretical warning, but as a direct consequence, that those who seek to be justified by the law have fallen away from grace, not because grace has been removed, but because they have stepped away from it, choosing to rely on something else, something that cannot sustain them, something that replaces dependence on Christ with dependence on self. And this is where the tension reaches its peak, because the choice before them is not between two equal options, it is between two entirely different foundations, one that leads to freedom and one that leads to bondage, one that produces life and one that produces striving. And Paul continues contrasting these two paths with precision, showing that through the Spirit, by faith, believers eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness, not something they achieve, but something they receive, something they trust in rather than work toward. And in this context, external distinctions lose their power, because in Christ, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything. What matters is faith, working through love. And that statement cuts through everything the Galatians were being told, because it removes the emphasis from outward markers and places it on something internal, something that cannot be measured by human standards, something that flows from relationship rather than regulation. And Paul reminds them that they were running well, that they had begun in the right direction, that their foundation was strong. And then he asks the question that reveals the disruption. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? Because something had intervened. Something had stepped into the path they were on and redirected them, not completely, not in a way that made the change obvious at first, but gradually, subtly, enough to alter their trajectory. And that is how distortion works. It does not always replace truth immediately. It adjusts it, reshapes it, adds to it until the original form is no longer recognizable. And Paul identifies the source of that influence not as divine, not as something that comes from the one who called them, but as something else entirely. Something that spreads, something that grows, something that grows, something that affects more than just a single point. And he uses an image that captures this perfectly. A little leaven leavens the whole lump, showing that even a small addition, even a slight change, has the power to transform everything. And that is why this cannot be treated as a minor issue, because its impact is not isolated, it spreads, it reshapes, it redefines, and Paul expresses confidence that the Galatians will not ultimately accept this distortion. But he also makes it clear that those who are troubling them will face judgment, because the message they are promoting is not neutral, it carries consequences. It leads people away from truth, and that is not something that can be ignored. And then, in a moment that reveals the depth of the misunderstanding, Paul addresses a claim that seems to have been made against him, that he still preaches circumcision, perhaps used by others to justify their position, to suggest that even Paul supports what they are teaching, and he responds by exposing the inconsistency of that claim, because if he was still preaching circumcision, he would not be facing persecution. The offense of the cross would have been removed, because the cross is offensive precisely because it removes human contribution. It declares that nothing can be added, that everything necessary has already been done, and that message challenges every system built on effort, every structure that relies on performance, every identity rooted in achievement, and that is why it creates resistance, because it takes away control. It removes the ability to earn. It confronts the belief that people can secure their standing through what they do, and Paul does not soften that offense. He does not adjust the message to make it more acceptable, because to do so would be to lose its power. And then his words take on a sharpness that reflects the seriousness of the situation, expressing a desire that those who are promoting this distortion would go even further in their actions, not as a literal command, but as a reflection of how completely their message contradicts the truth, showing that what they are introducing is not a small addition, it is a complete misdirection. And from there, Paul brings the focus back to the Galatians themselves, reminding them of their calling, that they were called to freedom, not as an opportunity for self-indulgence, not as a license to act without restraint, but as a new way of living, one that is not governed by law, but guided by love, because freedom does not remove responsibility. It redefines it, shifting it from obligation to transformation, from external enforcement to internal motivation. And this is where the balance of the message becomes clear, because the freedom Paul defends is not empty, it is not directionless, it is not detached from how life is lived. It produces something. It expresses itself in love, in service, in a way of relating to others that fulfills the very essence of what the law pointed toward without being bound by its structure. And this is the life the Galatians are being called back to, not a system of rules, but a relationship that transforms how they live, how they act, how they see others. And as the letter moves toward its final movement, the tension begins to shift from confrontation to application, from defending the foundation to showing what it looks like when that foundation is lived out. Because the question is no longer only what is true, but how that truth shapes everything that follows. And the answer will determine whether the freedom they have been given remains a reality or becomes something they slowly leave behind. The argument had been fought. The truth had been laid bare. The line between freedom and slavery drawn with a clarity that left no room for confusion. And now everything moved toward one final question. Not what is true, but what does that truth look like when it is lived? Because a message, no matter how powerful, remains incomplete if it does not transform the life of the one who receives it. And Paul brings the letter to its final movement by shifting the focus from foundation to expression, from what the gospel is to what the gospel produces. Because freedom is not empty, it is not passive, it is not a space where nothing happens. It is a new way of living, a new way of being shaped from the inside out. And that transformation is not driven by law. It is driven by the Spirit. And this is where everything comes together, because the same Spirit that began the work now continues it, not through external pressure, but through internal change. And Paul presents this not as an abstract idea, but as a daily reality, a choice that must be made continually, to walk by the Spirit, to allow that internal presence to guide, to shape, to direct every step. And in doing so, something begins to happen. Something that cannot be produced by effort alone, something that the law could never achieve, because the law can restrain behavior, but it cannot transform the heart. It can define right and wrong, but it cannot create the desire to live differently. And that is where the Spirit works, not by forcing compliance, but by reshaping desire itself, creating a conflict within, a tension between what is natural and what is new, between the pull of the flesh and the direction of the Spirit. And Paul does not hide this tension. He reveals it, because it is part of the reality of living in freedom, that the old patterns do not disappear instantly, that the struggle remains, but it is no longer the same kind of struggle. It is not a fight to earn acceptance. It is a movement toward becoming what has already been given, and this is where the contrast becomes visible. Because the works of the flesh are evident, they reveal themselves in actions, in behaviors that reflect a life centered on self, on desire without restraint, on relationships distorted by selfishness, on choices that lead not to life, but to fragmentation. And Paul lists them not to condemn, but to clarify, to show what grows when life is shaped by something other than the Spirit. And the warning that follows is not empty, it is real. That those who live in that pattern, who remain in it, who are defined by it, will not inherit the kingdom of God, because that way of living reflects a different foundation, a different source, a different direction entirely. And in contrast, Paul presents something radically different, not a list of rules, but a description of what grows when the Spirit is at work, what naturally emerges when life is rooted in something deeper than effort, something that cannot be manufactured but can only be cultivated through relationship. And this is where the focus shifts completely, because instead of striving to achieve, the believer begins to produce, not through force, but through connection. And what is produced is described as fruit, something organic, something that grows over time, something that reflects the nature of its source. And that fruit is not singular, it is multifaceted. It expresses itself in love, in joy, in peace, in patience, in kindness, in goodness, in faithfulness, in gentleness, in self-control. And these are not separate goals to be achieved. They are the evidence of a life aligned with the Spirit, the natural result of something deeper taking place within. And against such things, there is no law, because they fulfill what the law could only point toward. They represent the very essence of what it means to live in alignment with God, not through obligation, but through transformation. And Paul brings this back to identity once again, reminding them that those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires, not as an act of self-punishment, but as a recognition that the old way no longer defines them, that their life is now shaped by something new, something greater, something that calls them forward rather than holding them back. And if they live by the Spirit, then they are to keep in step with the Spirit, not moving ahead in their own strength, not falling behind into old patterns, but walking consistently in alignment with what has been given. And this movement is not isolated. It affects how they relate to one another, how they respond to weakness, how they carry burdens, how they restore those who fall. Because freedom does not create independence from others, it creates responsibility toward them, a call to serve, to support, to act in humility rather than comparison. And Paul warns against the subtle dangers that can arise even within this freedom. The temptation to become conceited, to provoke, to envy, to measure oneself against others, because those patterns reflect the old way of thinking, the old system of value, and they must be left behind just as much as the law itself, because they are rooted in the same desire for validation through comparison and performance. And instead, each person is called to examine their own work, to carry their own load, not in isolation, but in responsibility, recognizing that growth is personal even within a shared community. And Paul continues, encouraging generosity, encouraging investment in what is good, reminding them that what is sown will be reaped, that actions have consequences, that direction determines outcome. And this is not a return to law, it is a recognition of reality, that a life aligned with the flesh leads to decay, while a life aligned with the Spirit leads to life. And that outcome is not random, it is the natural result of what is cultivated over time. And so he urges them not to grow weary in doing good, because transformation is not instant. Growth takes time, fruit develops gradually, and the temptation to give up can arise when results are not immediately visible. But the promise remains, that in due time there will be a harvest, and that promise anchors everything, giving purpose to persistence, meaning to endurance, and direction to every choice made along the way. And as the letter draws to its close, Paul returns once more to the central issue, contrasting those who seek to make a good showing in the flesh, who promote circumcision to avoid persecution, to maintain appearance, to secure approval, with the reality of what truly matters, that neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but a new creation. And that phrase carries the weight of everything he has been saying, because it shifts the focus entirely from external markers to internal transformation, from what can be seen to what is real, from what can be measured to what is lived. And for Paul, this is not theory, it is personal, it is marked on his own life, not through outward signs of achievement, but through the scars he carries. The evidence of the cost he has paid to remain faithful to the message he was given, and he closes not with argument, but with blessing, a final reminder that everything rests on grace, not earned, not maintained through effort, but given freely, sustaining, guiding, completing what has begun. And this is where the story of Galatians leaves us, not with a question of what was decided then, but with a question that continues now, because the same tension still exists, the same pull toward control, toward effort, toward measurable righteousness, and the same invitation remains, to step into freedom, to remain in it, to live from it, not as something abstract, but as a reality that shapes everything, every thought, every action, every relationship. And the choice is still the same. Will you trust what has already been done? Or will you return to what you feel you must do? Because in the end, that choice determines everything. If this story made you see Galatians differently, if you felt the tension between grace and effort, then don't scroll away just yet, because the next story might shake you even more.